Welcome to the AUA's all-new monthly podcast series that focuses on leadership and business topics relevant to the entire urologic care team. Please join us each month on the Inside Tract as our subject matter experts explore various aspects of today's rapidly changing business environment. We hope you enjoy this episode where Dr. John McConnell and Dave Rickelton provide an overview of physician compensation models.
Good day, everyone. I'm John McConnell. I'm a member of the AUA and have been actively involved in a variety of AUA activities over the years. And we're here today to share with you some insight and information about physician compensation models. And I'll introduce my colleague, Dave Rickelton. Who's also, like me, a member of the Wake Forest team. But we're going to speak very broadly today about general models and sort of general advice, and without reference to any specific models that we may or may not be involved with. So, Dave, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me this morning. My name is Dave Rickelton. I'm the Director of Clinical and Faculty Compensation at Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center, which is really now a part of Atrium Health. So I have to make sure I include that in there as well. But in my role, I've spent the last 8 years really focused on compensation models, both for those working in our faculty practice, those in our physician network model, and lots of time working with our advanced practice providers and how they're compensated as well. So happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think it would be important for our listeners today, which we're very grateful to all of you for participating in this conversation, that we both have had, both at Wake Forest and in my prior career at UT Southwestern, a lot of experience with compensation models, not just in academic medical centers, but within physician networks more broadly. So we're going to be discussing some of that. So, Dave, I'm going to start this a little bit from the standpoint of, we're going to talk about compensation, which folks generally would be framing as their monetary compensation, their take-home, if you will, plus benefits and things of that nature. But you and I both know from our personal experience that a lot of these conversations that relate to physicians, especially as they're relating to another party, be it a larger practice or a hospital health system or an academic medical center, in fact, are really most concerned about what their ultimate reward system is going to be like. And I'd like you to comment about that briefly, and then I have some thoughts about that. So without getting into models, what do doctors ask you about?
Well, I think, the concept of one of the newer buzzwords these days is more of a concept of total rewards, and looking at a total package of not only just compensation, but benefits as well. Being really in the compensation side, I think most of the questions that I will get are just more high level around, what proportion of my compensation would be fixed, what's variable in nature, meaning not guaranteed and up to some type of threshold. Is there a salary model available? What kind of guarantee am I going to be on, especially for new physicians and faculty members? Those are more the higher level questions I'll field from time to time. And it's more just about the really basic components of, like you said, your take-home pay. What am I going to earn each month? What's your frequency for paying out any incentive plans and things of that nature?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this, Dave, is whether you're, so we have a very eclectic audience in these podcasts. And so we have folks who are responsible for administering these plans. They're kind of on the other side of the equation, so to speak. And then we have the individuals who are actually trying to decide whether this makes sense for them. And I think what is really, really important for both parties, if you will, to understand is that what's largely driving this from the physician side, in my opinion, is a sense of fairness. And that's deeply embedded in all of us from when we were little. Is how our brain is wired, is that we react very negatively to any sense that were not being treated fairly. And in my experience, disagreements or major issues around individual physician compensation have at their root some belief on the part of the physician that they're not being treated fairly. And I think it's really important for both the urologist, but also the entity, whether it is large group practice, health system, it doesn't really matter, this sense of fairness. So that psychology is actually quite important. And I would say, especially from the administrative side, I've heard over the years that, Dr. So-and-so is being unreasonable about something. And I'm always trying to discipline myself to reflect back on that and think, okay, they're probably thinking they're not being treated fairly. And that can go well beyond total cash compensation and benefits. It can, for example, be their working conditions. It could, for example, be their call schedule. It could, for example, be their level of mid-level support and other things that they believe is necessary to make them successful. However, they might articulate that to whoever they're negotiating with as a monetary issue. And so I think it's important for both the urologist who's in that situation, but also the administrative leadership of whatever the entity is, to realize that it's, although it's often about the money, it's not solely about the money. It's about many of these other things that represent the reward systems that we have embedded in us. So I think that's really, really important to acknowledge and understand. So Dave, so in general, having said that, what are the basic components of what you and I would call total compensation? What are you seeing out in the broader market? What would lead or funnel into that?
So I think that, one of the terms that you really have to work on defining is that concept of salary. What is my salary? What is it made up of? And generally, when you're in the world of physician compensation, there will be three primary components that will make up someone's salary or total cash comp. First and foremost is the amount of base compensation that you would see in a monthly check or a biweekly check, and that's the comp that's coming to you that's guaranteed. It's part of your base salary. Very rarely will that be impacted. A lot of the times that is established at the beginning of a fiscal year, calendar year, whatever the organization is running on. That base salary is essentially guaranteed, unless there's a major shock to a system or a complete change in work environment, or the physician would step down from a primary role they're serving. By and large, that's an amount of money that's guaranteed, paid monthly. Normally, if you're looking at clinical compensation for base salary, it's going to be about 80 to 85% would be generally what you should expect from as part of what would be in your base salary. A second component would be what I refer to as variable, but it really is more of a, if you want to just term it as a withhold. That's generally another common term you'll hear, but that's the amount of money that's held back. It's paid usually quarterly to a physician based on their performance, either to a plan or on their personal work RVU production. That becomes necessary to a large extent because, the employer, the health system, the private practice group, whatever employment model you're in, they're relying on collections to come in, and if all of that money is given up front as part of the base salary, they could end up overpaying physicians for work that they may not be doing. So generally, that withhold is paid quarterly. It's going to generally be in the 15 to 20% range of what you would see, and that would be part of your total cash compensation package, but not part of your base, and paid out quarterly based on how you have performed as an individual and how the group has performed overall in some instances. And a third piece for total cash comp would be, if there's any other incentive plans that are available. It's not uncommon to see models that would pay your base comp and your variable comp up to a certain threshold. And then once you've passed a threshold of RVU production, let's say, there would most likely be $1 per RVU that could be promised to you, again, depending on employment model. that would be incentive compensation, and that's generally going to be paid out one time a year. But those are the three primary components of compensation that I think are rather prevalent in the market: a level of base, expectation of variable paid out quarterly, and then some potential incentive plan at the end of the year. And that incentive plan could also be quality or value driven as well. Those are becoming more common in the marketplace to ensure that it's not just RVU production that's driving compensation, but there's some at risk for quality and value as well.
Thanks, Dave. So you referenced RVU models, so I want to comment on that in a little bit more detail. But let me say there are probably still probably a fairly small number of remaining, mainly private practices of urology in America, where they still may be on a collection model, where there's some distribution into the central pot, if you will, for overhead. But other than that, the individual physician might, quote, take home whatever they brought in the way of actually cash collections. And we don't have any data on that I'm aware of, but that is not certainly the common model today, given the fairly large number of physicians that are employed by either large group practices or employed by hospital health systems. But those models still exist. So on the issue of RVUs, just very briefly on the basis of that is that, and they're still confused. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a physician who seemed to have some confusion about what an RVU was relative to their compensation. And we live in a world, Dave and I do, where compensation is largely RVU based, but it's actually specifically work RVU based. So when CMS many years ago developed this system, relative value units reflected the work of the physician, the overhead of the practice, and a small component, roughly 4% or so, on the cost of maintaining medical liability insurance. And so if you round all that, roughly half of a RVU total payment is work related. And because many of these systems, especially at the health system level, are facility based, what the physician is actually looking at is the work component of the RVU, which is roughly 1/2. It's actually 48%, but let's call it 1/2. So many of the models, probably the majority of the models that are out there today, are based on work RVUs. And one important role for organized urology, specifically the AUA, is to work really hard, as we do, through health policy and other groups, to ensure that our time and effort is being adequately recognized in especially the work component of the RVU. And I might come back to that a little bit, but that's the basis of the so-called work RVU component of compensation. So Dave, on these variable components, let me ask you a couple of specific questions about that. So is it in your experience, is it largely the variable component is driven by productivity above what was expected in the year from a work component, or what's it really being driven by?
Normally, the variable component is driven by the baseline expectation of what a physician is expected to do during a fiscal year. So if you're in a group where you're preparing budgets, there's an RVU budget that a physician may have, and let's say that's 5,000 RVUs in total for the year. That variable component is really just truing up to that amount of work effort. If the physician is 4,900 RVUs at the end of the year, that physician should expect to make a little less. If they're right at 5,000, then they should probably earn exactly what the employer said they should make, which is that combination of base and variable. Most of the time, if you're looking at incentive plans, it's going to be for physicians that have exceeded that 5,000 RVU benchmark. And again, that's just a hypothetical number. So if they did 5,200 during a fiscal year, that 200 RVUs is normally what's going to be used to drive an incentive calculation. But most of the time, if they're given a target, That's what they're looking for their base and their variable. Anything above that would be incentive. If they missed that mark, then they would expect to make a little less. And that's really the purpose of those true ups, to ensure that the physician is paid for the work that they did, and not paid for work that wasn't done, based on, which could be based on a myriad of factors that we could certainly have a whole other podcast on. But generally, that's the true up, just the base and the variable.
Yeah, and as you indicated, Dave, there's a lot of interest, discussion around these other parameters, quality, safety, and those sort of things. But at least in my insight is that today, in our specialty of urology, those are not playing really big factors. Those things are really designed more to incentivize primary care physicians who are in at-risk models, and most urologists are not in those type of models. So, Dave, so what are the downsides, since these RVU, specifically work RVU models, represent the vast majority of kind of the major metric driving these comp models? What's the downside of that in your experience?
One, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is just competition for those work RVUs. If the model is very rich in RVU production and payments are very rich on the RVU side to a physician based on a per unit, a lot of that can drive competition between physicians working within the same practice. Those RVU models can be detrimental if there are, if you also have an APP model that is also incentivizing APPs driven solely off an RVU model, that can also cause competition for that work effort. I will see instances from time to time where a particular group has been very busy for many years. Leader of that group may just purposefully have fewer physicians than they need to run that practice. Physicians begin to learn to really enjoy some of that, and they almost build it in as a way to earn extra income throughout the year. But at some point, that is not sustainable, and a new provider will come into that group, and those are usually going to be, spread now across a larger group of people, meaning those making that money at that point were going to begin to see less. So I do see that happen from time to time, that I think groups should be concerned with. It's a little dangerous too from an access standpoint if all of a sudden one of those providers goes out for whatever reason, and now you really are in dire straits with trying to get patients into the door. So that's one item I would certainly be wary of. And really, I think it's just, there's a burnout mechanism that can certainly occur with these RVU models, where physicians feel that they are on a constant treadmill, that everything is driven by RVU production, that they really can't get off that treadmill, or they're going to see that drop in income. And so that's probably one of the other big ones that we hear a lot about in the market now, is really this concept of burnout, especially coming through this really difficult time of COVID, and people are already weary. And now they're back into these RVU models. It can really lead to a lot of burnout pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah, that's great insight, Dave. And I think that specifically, and especially of urology, one of the things that I'm aware of, and I think this might be true in the surgical subspecialties in general, is that the relative value system, which was the structure that led ultimately to the concept of RVUs, was designed to, in my opinion, I'll just express it to that, is to level the playing field between so-called cognitive and non-cognitive specialties. And my own view is it's now slightly, if not more than slightly, working against folks who are doing really complex surgical procedures. And if I look at the RVUs, for example, for a radical cystectomy, which probably has the highest morbidity rate of any operation we do in urology, especially if the patient has comorbidities, et cetera, that it's, frankly, you're better off economically staying in your office and creating work RVUs, seeing more patients, doing more office-based procedures, than you are doing these major cases, even though we clearly need the docs who are capable and able to do those major cases. So I think that is, my own opinion, that is a need to refine RVU-based compensation in many large programs, large private practices, or academics. It probably doesn't make a difference, is you've got this group of folks who are doing the really big cases. And I think they may be somewhat disadvantaged, frankly, in the RVU model. And it's not just the operation, it's everything pre and post relative to that. So are you sensing that at all in other specialties beyond urology?
Absolutely. I think there are many groups that will have that type of phenomenon, and the group as a whole, really the compensation model and structure really has to account for exactly what you just laid out, that there are going to be procedures and cases that could be very long in nature with a very low RVU generation. And you could have physicians working within the same quote unquote specialty, but have varying levels of RVU production just based on some of the subspecialty that they may work within. And so as group administrators or practice administrators are thinking through that, there really does need to be some acknowledgement of that within the compensation plan that generally everyone can understand and accept. You look at cardiology as a good example. When you've got 3 to 4 different subspecialties within those types of practices that are going to be, your generalists, those that are going to be invasive, those that are going to be interventional, and they all make very different amounts of money within survey data, but all of that group's fortunes are really dependent upon each other, from the general cardiologist that refers to the invasive, the invasives to the interventionalist. And so it really is important that that's acknowledged. And that's a great point you make, Dr. McConnell, that is certainly something that RVU model can certainly, it can be detrimental to those that are doing that really hard work that may not be generating the level of RVU production that their peers do, but there's value in the work that they do, and it's important in it. I think it's vital that that's acknowledged within the plan.
Yeah, and Dave, I think we agree on that, and it relates back to sort of my opening comments about this sense of fairness that underlies the fundamental basis of whether you do or do not have a wise compensation plan, whether you're the beneficiary of such a plan or whether you're the administrator of such a plan. The sense of fairness is extremely important. So, Dave, let me just pivot from that a little bit and talk about. You briefly mentioned these other components. So we've talked about kind of base compensation, variable compensation, that's productivity based. But let's talk a little bit about the importance of the, I would say benefits are tangible. So I want to talk about that. But then there are the intangibles about on-call and things of that nature. So what is your insight into those components?
So benefit level really is going to be largely a function of whatever employment model a physician decides to pursue. A private practice group, you may be entering into a environment where there really isn't a lot of supplementing that cost of that insurance, if any. A lot of that can be really borne completely by the physician from buying that health insurance. And it could be that the group will certainly have access to a plan, but those plans can tend to be more expensive potentially. Entering into an employed model where you may be working for a large health system, you may find a much richer benefit structure, such as health insurance that is to some extent supplemented. You may find 401k contribution matches. You may find, other perks that, that are those tangible things like, just your basic things from vision to dental to health insurance to, other supplemental life insurance policies you could be able to access. But those are more the tangible things that you'll see and need to understand the value of those. And those are, employer provided benefits, and there's a cost to the employer to provide them. And sometimes those costs can be rather substantial. So it's certainly something you don't want to overlook. And then some of the intangibles, I think you mentioned that earlier, Dr. McConnell, again, back to this concept of fairness. how easy is it to work where you're going to be working? How is access? Are you working in a large center where it takes you 25 minutes to walk from your car to your office? Are you working in a system that's not efficient? Are you able to even hit the RVU production that you're being asked to hit based upon how the work environment is? Those are some of those intangibles that are a little harder to nail down. But I think asking lots of questions and really thinking about where you're going to be working, who you're going to be working for, who you're going to be working with, maybe even asking to shadow a day to see how the operation works and if it is efficient. But that's another intangible that I will hear from time to time, that it's just hard to work here. We just can't get in. We don't have enough ORs. We don't have enough staff. We can't get anything scheduled. We have a high cancel rate. All those things are intangibles. It's a benefit because if it's there and you can be productive, you can earn more money. But if those are not in place, that's another intangible that I think is it's difficult to determine, but certainly something you need to think about when you're looking at, really your total rewards kind of thing, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah, and Dave, I thought that was really, really well said. And I'm now actually currently coaching some of our residents who are interviewing for both sort of 1/2 private practice jobs, 1/2 academic jobs, but the issues are the same. And they're while appropriately, they're really focused on their, what their deal looks like, to use that term. And for example, in a private practice model, it's what's the Tract to partnership look like? Because often there are investments that are required either in terms of salary withhold or actually, writing a check for ultimately being a partner. Those are basically non-existent in the health system-based employment models, but still exist. And I frankly think they're very healthy models myself. But what we're really talking about here is what is fascinating is people are not thinking through exactly what you just said, especially young people who are, getting ready to join a group or join an academic practice, or frankly, even as established urologists who are looking at making a change, is, again, cash compensation benefits extremely important, but they, in my experience, don't really spend enough time thinking through what the actual practice experience is. And when I talk to physicians who are experiencing some objective signs of burnout, it's not about their compensation, it's about their work environment. And so I think it's really important, especially for the young folks who may be listening to this podcast, to really, really deeply understand what it's going to be like to practicing in the environment that's being offered to you, the level of support, the efficiency of the EMR system, your ability to get into the operating room, your ability to do what you trained to do, which is to take really good care of your patients. So I think that's one of the major messages we want to confer today is that, yeah, you want to be really knowledgeable about these compensation models and what your economic deal is, but you need to spend almost equal time understanding what your practice environment is going to be like. So Dave, as we're probably in the next 10 minutes or so going to be reaching a conclusion here, you've had this amazing experience running these programs. I've had an experience dealing with people who object to various things that occur, but you actually have to run these things. So we may have practice administrators on this podcast. What would you advise them? What are the really important tricks that you've learned over the years?
Well, I think this, part of that answer really just it comes down to being in the compensation realm in the first place. And I think one of the very first things to realize is this concept of fairness, this concept of equitable. You can get there, but it will only exist for a very brief moment in time. And then at the next hire, all of that is gone. Markets are constantly changing. And I think that a healthy group will really have a robust compensation committee that is made up of different types of individuals, those that are on the administrative side and those that are really on the practice side, and making sure there's a healthy level of respect there for both parties. That the administrative side may be bringing in, more, that may be perceived they're bringing in more roadblocks, but in a lot of cases, people like me are simply just trying to make sure the groups understand the market, make sure the groups understand changes that are occurring in the market and what it may lead and what it may do to compensation. So I think, this concept of fairness and equity, while it's desirable, it will only happen for a brief moment in time. And that's one thing I think I would immediately acknowledge. Number two is really, it's just listening. I think, in my experience, it has been just a matter of listening in a very purposeful way. What is the issue? What is driving the dissatisfaction? And as you said, Dr. McConnell, it's not always going to be simply compensation. Listening to what the concern is, and then helping find a data-driven way to address it, especially if it comes down to a perceived fairness in compensation. I think being able to show compensation data, survey data, not that you need necessarily to share their peer compensation, but show them where they are in the market and what their RVU production look like. The data within these benchmarks are very good. They're from all over the country, and there's many different ways you can cut them. But I think just coming to understand what those benchmarks are and how they're used, being able to help people understand really how their compensation is driven. And really to help also on the fairness side is having a compensation plan that's clear, that's transparent, that's easy to understand, that helps the physician feel that they are being treated, fairly, that the rules of the game are laid out at the beginning, that those rules aren't changed midstream, that there's no hidden agenda behind the scenes about how a physician's compensation is determined. It really needs to be very, very, very well laid out, so that a group can see it and understand it and know, okay, I understand. This is my base. This is what I have to do to get my variable compensation. If the group does well over this next year, we all have the ability to earn additional incentive compensation, and this is how that is calculated, so that really it's not shrouded in this mystery. And that's where I see most of the issues pop up, is just physicians not understanding, and that becomes a trust issue, and that leads to those issues of fairness and equity, which can lead you down very different paths than if you have a plan that's just laid out well. It's easy to understand, and so I think that's where most of our problems will pop up, is when physicians just don't understand, and that leads to what we led off with, Dr. McConnell, that concept of fairness. If they feel that things are being hidden, if they feel that there's a hidden agenda there, the only thing they're going to feel is that they're not being treated fairly, and that's going to cause a lot of issues, I think, within some of the practices if that's not tended to.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That is very well said. The only thing I would add to that at all, or just to emphasize one point and maybe add one new one, is that the importance of, especially in larger groups, of having some internal governance structure. Sending memos to folks about compensation is an incredibly bad idea. And so what you want is a trusted group internal to the practice, not just one person, but a group that's going to be the governance group over what the basic model is, but also how to adjudicate issues that might come up during the year, and then transparently communicating that to the practice as a whole. Extremely important. The only other thing I would add, and I think it's well beyond the scope of this podcast, is that there are important, I wouldn't say burdensome, but important federal laws that govern even the concept of fairness and equity in compensation models, but also govern what sort of economic streams can actually be factored into compensation, and to avoid situations of conflict of interest, antitrust, and kickback sort of issues. And I'm sure others will cover that in another day. So, Dave, I want to thank you. Your expertise as a administrator of not just a large academic plan, but a plan that includes APPs and network physicians that are non-academic. You bring a lot to the table. So thank you so much, Dave, for your contributions. And I want to thank the leadership of the AUA for giving us the opportunity to produce this podcast under the auspices of AUA Insight. So thanks very much. I hope you've learned something today. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. For additional episodes in this podcast series, please visit the AUA Inside Tract podcast at auanet.org/podcast. If you have any research focused on leadership, business, or practice management, please consider submitting your article to AUA's peer-reviewed journal, Urology Practice. For instructions for submission, please see auajournals.org and click on Urology Practice. This journal publishes cutting-edge articles on clinical trends, challenges, and practice applications in the 4 areas of business, health policy, the specialty, and patient care.